Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared Leary. If you're new to this podcast, every week I alternate between an interview with someone in CS education and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship and its potential implications for computer science educators. This week's episode is an unpacking scholarship episode, and it is of the paper titled Increasing Diversity in K-12 Computer Science, Strategies from the Field. And this paper is written by Joanna Goode, who is the author of the paper that I talked about 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, the paper was mainly about some of the larger things to take in consideration for bigger implementations or initiatives in like a community or a district. But this week's episode is going to focus on individual strategies that teachers can use in the classroom setting. So we're starting with big picture, and now we're kind of narrowing it down into, okay, yeah, but what can I do as an individual? So here's the abstract from this paper. Quote, "In this paper, I describe features of computer science programs which have successfully attracted underrepresented students to study CS. Drawing from my own teaching experiences, research, and teacher education work, I provide strategies which have diversified K-12 CS courses." The paper also points out how many of these features rely on committed partnerships between schools, school districts, universities, and the CS industry. End quote. So if I were to give a one-sentence summary of this paper, I would say that this paper provides suggestions for strategies to increase diversity in K-12 computer science. Although this particular episode will unpack this paper, what I do recommend if you want to read the actual paper is go to the show notes, and if you click on the title of the article, then it'll take you directly to the paper itself. And if you click on the author's last name, then it'll take you to their Google Scholar profile where you can read more publications by this particular author. All right, so here's a quote on page 362 that begins this article. Quote, "Computer science holds the unfortunate distinction as a highly segregated profession in terms of both gender and race. The underrepresentation of females and people of color occurs at the professional level, university level, and in K-12 education." End quote. At the time of publication, which was 2008, the author notes that university enrollment figures were actually getting worse in gender. So less women were signing up for computer science education than there were previously. Now, even though this paper was published 12 years ago, we're still having the same conversations about representation within computer science education. And one of the papers that I'm going to unpack in the future Unpacking Scholarship episode talks about how this isn't the case in some other areas. So in CS education, if we already had a diversity problem, and in 2008 things were getting worse in terms of gender diversity, what can we do about it? So the author provides some suggestions that are based off of their experience as both a high school computer science teacher and a teacher educator. So not only do they have practice in a K-12 setting, but they also have practice teaching teachers how to teach. All right, so the main categories or strategies are around recruitment, culturally relevant curriculum, powerful pedagogy, role models, and clear pathways in computer science. All right, so let's unpack each of those. So under recruitment, one suggestion that the author recommends is she mentioned that she became the coach of the girls' swim team, which allowed her to purposefully recruit students to help diversify gender in her classroom. So in other words, as an individual educator in your school, think of what kind of clubs or organizations or events that you could participate in to potentially recruit students to be in your class. So another teacher in this article mentioned that they would go to each one of the math classes, present on the benefits of computer science education using slides with diverse images or media. Then she would personally deliver a letter to each student, which invited them to join the class. So as an example of the success rate of this person's class increased from 12 students to 47, 20 of which were girls, when there were none who had previously signed up. Now, the author notes it's not just recruiting for recruitment's sake, but recruiting purposefully to help diversify your classroom and your program. So not just, I want to get more people, it's more about diversifying the students than it is about increasing the enrollment numbers. Now, if you listen to previous interviews with guests, there are many who have mentioned recruiting by having students go into classrooms or recruiting others one-on-one, or even speaking with school counselors or administrators about who can participate in computer science, because there are misperceptions about how computer science is basically only for white and Asian males, which I've talked about in other Unpacking Scholarship episodes. So the next header, culturally relevant curriculum. Now, I've already talked about culturally relevant curriculum and pedagogy in other episodes. For example, the Unpacking scholarship titled Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy actually unpacks the seminal paper that led to culturally relevant pedagogy. But in this particular section, the author is basically talking about the importance of diversifying how kids can engage in the class in ways that are culturally relevant and meaningful. So here's a quote from page 363. Quote, "In youth culture today, many students engage in pop technology use through the use of mobile phones, iPods, YouTube, and social relationship sites. Yet most CS courses I visit rarely, if ever, make the explicit connection between learning computing concepts and the concepts' applications in these pop technologies." End quote. Now, it's a little funny reading about iPods, definitely dates the paper a little bit, but the overall message still holds true. It's something that we do in our professional development and the curriculum that I create. It's all about getting kids to find meaningful applications of exploring their interests in some kind of a way in a computer science or coding class. The author also suggests engaging in social interests of the kids that you work with. So it's not just the technological interests, but things that kids are socially interested in. So for example, rather than discussing creating a program for a non-existent company, like a hypothetical company, instead, kids could create software for a personal or community-based purpose with the exact same concepts and practices you would have done in the original project. And the author also mentions that it's important to diversify what kids engage with in the classroom that connects with computer science. So not just providing the same one-size-fits-all solution, oh, everyone is going to be interested in this topic because of blah, 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 but instead saying, like, hey, here are several different topics that you could pursue that are related to several different interests. Okay, so the next suggestion, powerful pedagogy. Okay, so there are three main categories under this particular section of the paper. One is content area knowledge, the next one is pedagogical content knowledge, and the last one is cultural diversity content knowledge. So let's talk about the three of those. So content area knowledge. So the author suggests that content knowledge is important, which, yeah, if you're going to teach something, it's important that you know the content knowledge. So districts need to provide professional development opportunities to help teachers who might not have a background in computer science education. Now, many of the guests on this podcast have argued that it's okay for students to know more than you, especially when you're starting out. But I'd give the caveat that it's okay when you first start, but you should constantly be learning more over time, so that's no longer the case. So if 10 years from now, while doing computer science, the students still know more than you, then I'd say that's problematic. So don't treat it as an excuse to, well, I don't need to know anything, I can just ask questions and they'll figure it out. But instead, just know that, okay, if I'm starting out and I have very little experience or background understanding of computer science, that's okay for where you're starting now. Just keep asking questions, keep learning over time, because then you'll continue to get better as an educator. All right, so the next subcategory within here, pedagogical content knowledge. Here's a quote from page 363. Quote, "In addition to CS content knowledge, effective CS educators draw from a range of pedagogical strategies meant to help students learn about a particular subject. The use of counterexamples, manipulatives, role plays, large-scale projects, and other pedagogical strategies illustrate different approaches for students to actively engage with the material. Knowing when students should work together in pairs, groups, or as a class is also part of this pedagogical content knowledge. These instructional considerations are a creative but time-laborious endeavor." End quote. So I've talked about this in other episodes, but this is where I think university professors in particular could better focus their attention. So in my opinion, it doesn't matter to students whether you know the ins and outs of everything related to a topic in computer science if you don't have the pedagogical chops to help others learn that topic. In other words, just because you're an expert at the topic area, it doesn't mean you're good at teaching it. So in addition to learning about the content area knowledge, it is very important to learn about how to teach and many different ways to teach, because you're not going to find a silver bullet that works for every single kid that you work with. And the last section under powerful pedagogy is cultural diversity content knowledge. So here's a quote from page 364. Quote, "Successful CS teachers of diverse students must be aware and counter the issues which prevent females and students of color from entering the CS pipeline." End quote. So in addition to knowing what to teach and how to teach, You also need to know the cultural contexts that are going on and at play in the classrooms that you work with in order to lift up marginalized and underrepresented people. So the author also draws attention to the fact that we shouldn't focus all of our attention on the kids who have prior knowledge or the ability to continue their learning outside of class. So in other words, if a kid took a outside of school like coding camp or something, or has been kind of self-teaching themselves at home, or actually has the ability to continue learning at home, we shouldn't focus all of our attention on them. I know I've been guilty of that in the past, where I have unintentionally provided more attention to the kids who are able to go further with things and less attention to the kids who are not. And that's something that I became aware of through my own reflective practices, such as recording myself and then analyzing my teaching and getting feedback from like students and teachers and administrators and whatnot. So yeah, I definitely second that. Now, the author also mentions that learning should not be teacher-centered, which is something that many of the guests and myself have talked about through many of the interviews on this podcast. So here's a quote from page 364. Quote, "Successful teachers create opportunities for students to deepen their understandings of CS subjects on applications or projects that are relevant to students and not always predetermined by the teacher." End quote. So that quote really resonates with me and aligns with a lot of what I have created with Boot Up's curriculum, which is 100% free and is all about having kids create something that is interesting to them rather than predetermined by myself, the curriculum developer, or teachers. So the last thing under this particular section is the author points out that we need to be aware of the stereotypes or unconscious bias we might have around various identities or ways of being. So for example, biases based on gender, race, sexuality, ability or disability, etc. Okay, so the next main strategy, role models. So the author highlights the importance of having role models of people who look like students. So here's a quote from page 364. Quote, "Of course, teachers can and typically do serve as powerful local role models, but having other computer scientists interact with students enhances their exposure to potential role models. Higher education and industry can both contribute through lab tours, classroom talks, media productions, or outreach programs." End quote. Now, I totally agree with this and have talked about this in other episodes. One of the things that I would recommend doing, if you haven't listened to it yet, is listen to the interview with Sarah Judd, where Sarah and I unpack the idea further by indicating it's not just about looking like somebody, which is important, but it's also about seeing somebody with similar interests as you who are engaging in computer science. So one of the examples that Sarah gives is including people who dance while engaging in computer science. Okay, the final strategy is clear pathways in CS. So here's a quote from page 364 that kind of unpacks the importance of why we need to have clear pathways in computer science. Quote, "This type of pathway information is not typically developed nor provided by schools, and educators and parents alike hold strong reservations about computing as a career due to fears regarding outsourcing. Providing information regarding undergraduate CS programs, potential careers, the availability of jobs, salary information, and other resources might help make the higher education and career pathway more transparent and alleviate some of the fears about pursuing the discipline." End quote. So I'd argue these fears still exist for some today. In fact, I got an email last week about somebody who was saying that AI is going to take over all programming jobs, and we engage in a discussion on that. So one potential avenue is to focus on computational thinking skills somebody learns, which might help alleviate some of those fears. But the suggestion that I just read seems to still be the driving narrative in discourse around computer science, especially with all the unemployment right now going on due to COVID-19. Okay, so the last section of this paper talks about institutional support. So this kind of goes back to what I talked about 2 weeks ago in the other Unpacking Scholarship episode. So the author recommends that we need to build an alliance between teacher educators, computer science scholars, administrators, CS teachers, community members, local companies, etc. So if you listen to the episode 2 weeks ago, it'll kind of talk more about that and what I'm about to discuss very briefly. So one suggestion is to ensure that courses are offered And a webinar that I recently attended talked about not just courses that have prereqs, but offering courses that have no prereqs, kind of like what I talked about 2 weeks ago. And the reason why that's important is because computer science isn't just for people who have taken a certain math level. It is for anyone. So we need to have offerings that reflect that. Another suggestion is to provide teacher professional development. I've talked about that in other episodes. For example, listen to the episode with McKay Perkins, where he talks about some of his experiences with computer science professional development. Next, the author recommends creating a community of computer science teachers. So 2 weeks ago, I mentioned checking out CSTA, which is the Computer Science Teachers Association, and discussion forum groups like CS for All Teachers, which I'll link to in the show notes. So here's a quote on why this is important and why the author recommends reaching out to other educators. This is from page 365. Quote, "Unlike teachers of other disciplines, CS teachers often have no colleagues at their school to talk to about instructional or curricular issues. As a result, teachers I have spoken with feel a sense of isolation and disconnect from the larger CS educational community. Additionally, rarely are these teachers encouraged or permitted to attend CS education conferences. In fact, out of dozens of teachers I have spoken with, none have received district-sponsored CS professional development before the University District Alliance offered the outreach programs." End quote. Totally agree. I've been to many conferences, and very rarely have I had a district ever reimburse me for that time. In fact, many times I had to take my own sick or vacation days off just so I could attend a conference or present at a conference or whatever. All right, so the last section under the institutional support is to develop student outreach programs to expose students to CS education. I like this, but I'd also argue that we could develop community outreach programs to help not just the students in our community, but anyone in the community. So think of all the people right now who might be out of jobs because of COVID that would benefit from some community education on this particular topic. All right, so as a quick summary, so the strategies that were recommended were to focus on recruitment, have culturally relevant curriculum, engage in powerful pedagogy, have diverse role models, and clear pathways in CS. In addition to the individual things that were just mentioned that any teacher can do, from an institutional support level, the author recommends ensuring courses are offered, providing PD, creating or joining a community of CS teachers, and developing student outreach programs. So at the end of each one of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to talk about some of my lingering questions or thoughts. So one question might be, how has the author's strategies continued to grow or change since 2008, when this was written? Another question that I have is, what strategies could we recommend for virtual versus in-person CS education? And I ask that because at the time of this recording, there's a lot going on with COVID, and many educators are working online. And so what can you do in online or virtual spaces to diversify your programs? And how does that compare to in-person strategies? And a final question that I have is, what strategies are missing that you've tried and wished other educators knew more about? Now, if you got something to share, you can use the hashtag CSK8 on Twitter. And you can send out a short tweet about some of the things that you have learned. You could join the CSTA group that focuses specifically on CSK8 on Facebook. Or you could go to my website and contact me and be a guest on the show. And we can talk about this topic as well as many other things related to computer science in elementary, middle school, high school, university, wherever. All right, so that's kind of a summary of this paper and some of my lingering questions or thoughts. If you would be so kind, please consider sharing this episode with somebody else who is also seeking to diversify their computer science program or classes. And make sure you check out the show notes if you're interested in listening to some of the podcasts I mentioned or checking out some of the other resources. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all having a wonderful week, and I look forward to talking to you again next week when I release another interview.